The battle for Stalingrad, which raged from the end of August 1942, was one of the most bitter engagements in a war notorious for its savage ferocity. It also marked the point where Hitler's growing disenchantment with his generals degenerated into almost total hostility. Hitler's military successes, from the occupation of the Rhineland to the fall of France, had all been achieved against the strident opposition of the majority of his senior army commanders. While Hitler's impatience with their defeatism and lack of faith in his expansionist strategies mounted, their dissatisfaction with his military adventurism turned close to mutiny. Following the invasion of Poland, when Hitler's plans for the campaign in the West were being formulated, army chiefs of staff considered his intentions so disastrous that they actively conspired to assassinate him. Halder, Chief of General Staff, carried a pistol during his visits to Hitler in the Reichstag, hoping for a favorable opportunity to end his irresponsibility before it ruined the German nation. Eventually, he decided that, as a human being and a Christian, he could not shoot down an unarmed man. As plans for the Western offensive began to appear more realistic, the crisis passed. Despite the overwhelming success of the campaign in the West, the distrust which had festered between Hitler and his generals was suppressed rather than eliminated. During the Polish campaign, Hitler had been content to make suggestions and recommendations. During the war with France, he had begun to exercise control over operational objectives. By 1941, he could turn the army's invasion plan for Russia on its head by refusing to prioritize the capture of Moscow, which was central to its strategy. At the end of 1941, Hitler stated that the senior officers who have risen from the general staff are incapable of standing severe strain and major tests of character. During the 1942 summer offensive, Admiral Speer recalled blunt statements that the generals were without honor, without intelligence, that they were liars, that he was dealing with a bunch of crooks, were often made by Hitler in the presence of numerous army officers. He could not be moved to adopt a more conciliatory tone. Instead, he became even more offensive. In the Soviet Union, Stalin had traveled in a diametrically opposite direction to Hitler. The irrational barbarity of the pre-war purges of Red Army officers had been chillingly exposed by the total inability of the Russian defenders to contain the initial onslaught of Operation Barbarossa. Stalin's hysterical execution of the generals he blamed for this catastrophe and his own frantic orders to counterattack amid the chaos at the front did little to foster a constructive relationship with his commanding officers. Nevertheless, as the first storm was weathered and the Red Army finally showed itself capable of inflicting reverses on the Germans, Stalin's attitude softened. While he continued to exercise a sometimes alarming degree of control over the direction of the Soviet war effort, he turned increasingly to the administrative and political tasks which were where his considerable talents could find their most effective outlet. Stalin's grasp of the economic and political realities of warfare was in sharp contrast to Hitler's fitful excursions into these areas. But it was the Führer's tactical ineptitude which was now dramatically exposed.
Weiches und
For 5 months at Stalingrad, the Russian and German troops played a deadly game of cat and mouse amongst the ruins of what had once been a thriving industrial metropolis. From the dank cellars beneath the ruined city to the wind-whipped rooftops of the factories, soldiers fought and died to gain control of buildings, street corners, and even sections of crumbling brickwork. As the BBC reported on October the 11th,
"This is not a battle for a locality or a river, but for street crossings and houses. Poland was conquered in 28 days. In 28 days in Stalingrad, the Germans took several houses. France was defeated in 38 days. In Stalingrad, it took the Germans 38 days to advance from one side of the street to the other."
The individual acts of heroic resistance by Russian troops became legendary.
When the fighting was at its heaviest, a communications wire was hit and telephone communications broken off. Private Kitain was ordered to find the fault and mend it. He crawled under heavy fire until he found the place where the wire had been torn by a shell fragment. At that moment, he was mortally wounded, but he found the strength to connect the wire with his teeth, and so he died, clenching the wires. The communications link was re-established.
While their stomachs might be contracting from starvation, the Russian troops at Stalingrad nurtured their spirits with music and song. In a dugout expressed the almost intolerable loneliness of those far from their loved ones, but constantly close to death.
In our dugout a log fires aflame, weeping resin, it sputters and sighs. The accordion's tender refrain sings of you and your smile and your eyes. We are now many light years apart and divided by snow-covered steps, though the road to your side is so hard. To death's door, it's an easy 4 steps.
Despite grinding resistance, by October, the Germans occupied 7/8 of the city. The Russian 62nd Army, under its newly appointed commander, General V.I. Chukov, was penned back against the Volga River. However, battered ferries from the east bank, running a gauntlet of bombs and artillery fire, kept the encircled defenders supplied with food and munitions. In the 3rd week of October, it seemed as if the Russians would be overrun. Only the inspirational leadership of Zhukov, rallying his forces from the thick of the action, and the Red Army's capacity to regain under cover of darkness the strong points they had lost by day, prevented the fall of the city. During the first half of November, the Volga was blocked by ice. Without the ferries, the Russian position became almost intolerable. In the air, while the Luftwaffe now flew only half the number of sorties it had managed at the outbreak of the battle, this was still twice what the Red Air Force could achieve. Again, the German army came within a whisker of overpowering the Russian defenses. A final attack was planned for November the 18th. But behind the Russian lines, preparations were already underway for a counteroffensive which would doom the Sixth Army's efforts and spell the collapse of the whole German campaign in the south. As early as August, the German High Command had warned Hitler of the dangers of advancing Army Group A into the Caucasus, while simultaneously using Army Group B to attempt the capture of Stalingrad. German military resources were totally inadequate to safeguard the flanks of this double spearhead. A gap soon developed between Groups A and B, which was 200 miles wide and guarded by just a single division. Not only did Hitler ignore the warnings of his generals, which grew more raucous as the campaign developed, but he continuously weakened the flanks of the two groups by siphoning off forces to feed his ongoing obsession with Stalingrad. As von Manstein wrote later,
To leave the main body of the army group at Stalingrad for weeks on end was a cardinal error. It amounted to nothing less than presenting the enemy with the initiative, and it was a clear invitation for him to surround the Sixth Army.
By the 19th of November, the Soviet counterattack routed the Romanian troops to the north of Stalingrad. While 100 miles to the south, the Red Army overran a mixed German and Romanian force. On November the 22nd, the two Russian armies met, and Stalingrad was encircled. Von Paulus, the inexperienced commander of the Sixth Army, requested that he be allowed to reform his troops and withdraw. During those first days of the encirclement, the Sixth Army had barely 6 days' rations of food and ammunition for only 2 days. Many of its artillery batteries were completely out of shells. On the 26th, Hitler delivered a personal message to the beleaguered troops of Stalingrad, ordering them to stand fast and promising to do all in his power to support them. The problem of supplies was turned over to the Luftwaffe, which had so valiantly supplied the pocket at Demyansk the previous spring. Goering, its commander, was summoned before Hitler and agreed to guarantee 550 tons of supplies per day. Despite the skepticism of the Army Chiefs of Staff, the airlift began on the 25th of November. The results of the first days of the operation were ominous for the troops still fighting the Rats' War amongst the cellars and ruins of the city. Only 65 tons were delivered on day 1. The same quantities arrived on day 2. On the third day, no supplies whatsoever reached the desperate German forces. The Luftwaffe had no safe landing grounds in the vicinity of the Sixth Army. As the German perimeter of control around the city shrank under Russian pressure, this situation consistently deteriorated. Thick fogs made flying hazardous, if not impossible. Freezing temperatures meant that aircraft servicing became a torturous task for the German mechanics. Added to this, the Red Air Force was increasing its sorties, and the tactics of its pilots were sharpening as the conflict wore on. The airlift proved a fiasco, and the German troops began to starve. However, the airlift was only part of Hitler's strategy to relieve the situation in Stalingrad. Von Manstein was ordered to form a relief force to be known as Army Group Don. Its immediate objective was to bring the enemy attacks to a standstill and recapture the positions previously occupied. Von Manstein's strategy involved an attack by Army Group Don towards Stalingrad and a breakout westwards by part of the Sixth Army. When both assault forces met, they would provide a corridor through which the remnants of the Sixth Army still engaged in Stalingrad could be withdrawn. Von Manstein's problems began even before his forces could attack the Russians. The reinforcements which would give Army Group Don its only hope against vastly superior Russian numbers failed to arrive. Worse, the Russian strength in the area was increasing. The 4th Panzer Army was forced to launch the offensive alone. Against all the odds, by the 17th of December, von Manstein had reached a position only 35 miles short of Stalingrad, forcing sections of the Red Army surrounding the city to break away from the siege to block the advance. By the 19th, the relief force had gained another 5 miles and was just 30 miles from making contact with the 6th Army. Von Manstein urgently requested Hitler to allow the 6th Army to retreat towards him and bring the Russians under fire from east and west. Once the two German forces met, then the 3,000 tons of supplies assembled behind the 4th Panzer Army could be pushed through to those retreating from the city. Faced with silence from Führer headquarters, von Manstein himself gave the order for the breakout to begin. It would be a desperate gamble for the 6th Army. Only 100 of its tanks remained operational, and these held sufficient fuel for a journey of 20 miles or less. The physical ability of von Paulus's half-starved troops to mount any sort of mobile campaign was also questionable. Faced with these risks, and in possession of previous orders from Hitler to stand firm, von Paulus disobeyed the direct order of von Manstein, his superior officer. In doing so, he doomed the majority of the 250,000 soldiers under his command to a slow and painful death. Events to the north and the south of the city now began to draw attention away from the fate of those marooned in Stalingrad. Far more than the success or failure of the struggle for one city was now at stake. In von Manstein's own words,
while the eyes of all Germany were on Stalingrad at the turn of 1942 to 43, and anxious hearts prayed for the sons who fought there, the southern wing of the Eastern Front was simultaneously the scene of a struggle even greater than that being waged for the lives and freedom of the 6th Army's gallant 200,000. The issue was no longer the fate of a single army, but the entire southern wing of the front, and ultimately of all the German armies in the East.
By Christmas Eve, the Red Army was within striking distance of Rostov. Only 2 days earlier, Army Group A had begun its withdrawal from the Caucasus. Should the Russians reach Rostov before them, their retreat would be cut off. The ordinary German soldiers only gradually became aware of the magnitude of the disaster which was upon them.
The truth was slowly borne in on us, as, dragging all they had with them, the remnants of defeated division after division fell back from all sides before the on-pressing enemy, crowding and cramming into the heart of the cauldron. Gradually, the columns of converging transport blocked all roads. On the road, guns were blown up, and weapons of all kinds, tanks included, which had come to a standstill for want of fuel. Fully laden lorries blocked in the snow went up in flames. Munition dumps were sprung. Vast supplies of provisions and clothing had to become huge fireworks so as not to fall into enemy hands. Installations erected at enormous effort were wiped out wholesale. The country for miles around was strewn with smaller equipment, tin hats, gas masks and cases, ground sheets, cooking utensils, ammo pouches, trenching tools, even rifles, machine pistols and grenades. All of this stuff had been thrown away because it had become a mere hindrance.
By the new year, the 4th Panzer Army, having abandoned the 6th Army to its fate, had withdrawn as far as Rostov. It provided the only effective barrier between the advance of Soviet forces and the capture of the city. By January the 7th, the Red Army was only 30 miles from Rostov, but remained slow to exploit its superiority. Hitler also remained slow to order a complete evacuation of the south. He waited until the 27th of January, when Army Group A seemed doomed, to finally allow its retreat through Rostov. On the 4th of February, the city fell to the Russians. The German 17th Army remained in the Caucasus, ordered to hold the Tarman Peninsula and the Kuban bridgehead to the Crimea. In Stalingrad, the situation of the 6th Army had deteriorated rapidly throughout January. On the 8th, von Paulus was offered terms for a surrender by the Russians. Hitler refused to allow him to capitulate. 4 days later, the 6th Army reported,
Heavy weapons now immobilized. Severe losses and inadequate supplies, together with the cold, have considerably reduced troops' powers of resistance. If enemy maintains attack at present strength, unlikely to hold out more than a few days longer.
The actuality was far more graphic. German troops were collapsing from starvation and exhaustion. They were dying of exposure, and some were committing suicide. Even when Army Group A had been withdrawn beyond Rostov, and the 6th Army's continued resistance served no strategic purpose, Hitler refused to allow them to surrender. On January the 31st, he made von Paulus a field marshal. The following day, von Paulus surrendered. He became the first field marshal since the unification of the state to fall into enemy hands. Announcing the disaster at Stalingrad to the rest of the forces in the east, the German High Command requested that officers in the field read out the last message received by shortwave radio from the ruins of the tractor factory Red October.
We are the last 7 survivors in this place. 4 of us are wounded. We have been entrenched in the wreckage of the tractor factory for 4 days. We have not had any food for 4 days. I have just opened the last magazine for my automatic. In 10 minutes, the Bolsheviks will overrun us. Tell my father that I have done my duty and that I shall know how to die. Long live Germany. Heil Hitler.
The jubilant Russian forces now surged westwards to bring the fight to the enemy. A war correspondent, Alexander Worth, described the scene on the road from Stalingrad.
This area in which the battle had raged only so very recently was now hundreds of miles from the front, and all the forces in Stalingrad were now being moved towards Rostov and the Donets. Weird-looking figures were regulating the traffic. Soldiers in long white camouflage cloaks and pointed white hoods. Horses, horses, and still more horses, blowing steam and with ice around their nostrils, were wading through the deep snow, pulling guns and gun carriages and large covered wagons and hundreds of lorries with their headlights full on. To the side of the road, an enormous bonfire was burning and shadow-like figures danced around, warming themselves. Then others would light a plank and start a bonfire of their own till the whole edge of the road was a series of bonfires. Thousands of soldiers were marching, or rather walking in large irregular crowds, through the west, through this cold, deadly night. But they were cheerful and strangely happy. They kept shouting about Stalingrad and the job they had done. Westward, westward.
After Stalingrad, the full fury of the Russian counteroffensive was unleashed against the retreating Germans. To the north of Voronezh, the Soviet attack had taken Kursk by the 7th of February. Kharkov fell on the 16th, despite the orders of Hitler that it be held to the last man. A major push southwards towards the Sea of Azov and westwards towards the river Dnieper threatened to completely encircle the remaining forces of Army Group Don and the section of Army Group A which had escaped from the Caucasus. The numbers with which the Russians attacked and the speed of their advance now proved their downfall. Crippled by lack of transport, bogged down in the early thaw and short of supplies, the Soviet thrust suddenly ran out of steam only 30 miles from the Dnieper crossing. Von Manstein immediately seized this opportunity to methodically chop off the spearheads of the Russian attack and stabilize the German front. Only a month after being retaken by the Russians, Kharkov was once again in German hands. By the 19th of March, Belgorod, more than 50 miles northeast of Kharkov, was also retaken. The thaw was now in full flood, and the annual spring lull descended on the whole of the eastern front. For the German army, it marked the close of a disastrous winter campaign. The Caucasus had been lost, as well as a large section of the Donets Basin and the strategic Don Bend. The Sixth Army had been destroyed. 4 other Axis armies had been gutted, and Stalingrad now lay 500 miles to the west of the German lines. Yet, in the end, the German generals counted themselves lucky that the situation was not far graver. Once again, during the winter of 1943, the Germans had found themselves retreating, having come tantalizingly close to reaching their ambitions and objectives. One of the retreating German troops described their withdrawal.
Completely cut off, the men in field grey just slouched on, invariably filthy and invariably louse-ridden, their weary shoulders sagging from one defensive position to another. The icy winds of those great white wastes, which stretched forever beyond us to the east, lashed a million white crystals of razor-like snow into their unshaven faces. Skin now loose, stretched over bone, so utter was the exhaustion, so utter the starvation. And whenever any individual could do no more, when even the onward driving lash of fear of death ceased to have any meaning, then, like an engine which has used its last drop of fuel, the debilitated body ran down and came to a standstill. Soon, a kindly shroud of snow covered the object, and only the toe of a jackboot or an arm frozen to stone could remind you that what was now an elongated white hammock had quite recently been a human being.
The twin failures of Stalingrad and the Caucasus were enormous psychological bombshells for German morale. The German army's belief in its own invincibility, dented by the retreat from Moscow, had now completely disintegrated. As supreme warlord, most of the blame for this lay squarely on the shoulders of Adolf Hitler. However, while the military tactics of Hitler were proving increasingly impossible for his generals to stomach, the political blunderings of the brutal and debauched administrators of occupied Russia were presenting them with a problem no less indigestible. For long stretches of the previous year, as many as 24 divisions of the German army had been diverted to attempting to suppress the growing menace of partisan sabotage. The rabid massacre of Soviet Jews, the indiscriminate torture and slaying of simple peasants, and the massive scale of reprisals in the wake of the slightest resistance had totally backfired against the Reichskommissars of the conquered territories. Far from inducing a paralyzing terror among the Russians, their excesses became the most effective recruiting campaign the partisans could wish for. In May of 1942, the first attempt was made to coordinate the disparate bands of partisans which had formed in response to the savage Untermensch policies of the German occupation. Republican and regional partisan headquarters were set up, and an official liaison between the movement and the Red Army was established for the first time. This meant that the activities of the partisans could now be directed against objectives of crucial importance to the overall military strategy. Training centers set up in 1941 were expanded to provide recruits with a rapid and comprehensive grounding in the art of guerrilla warfare. Partisans were taught demolition procedures, wireless operating, intelligence gathering, and how to forge and amend official German documentation. Where the geography of the region allowed it, such as in the Ukraine or Bryansk, the partisans operated in military bands of thousands of resistance fighters, which kept close communication ties with the army and civilian population. The underground Communist Party organization was strengthened to provide a rudimentary governmental structure in the occupied areas. One of the most constant and rewarding targets of the partisans were the German rail connections with their active fronts. No matter what precautions the German army took, the partisans still seemed to manage to outwit them. Farid Fazliametu, a miner, later described how
the Germans built fortifications, laid mines around crossings, stations and bridges, and chopped down trees on both sides of the tracks. Guards mowed down people who appeared on the tracks or anywhere near them. We often watched German sappers with dogs and mine detectors moving down railway tracks. We would lay our mines after the guards had passed. Fooling the bloodhounds was more difficult. They had been trained to nose out tolite, a compound of TNT, so they found the mines. Then we started to divert their attention by dropping little bits of tolite here and there. The dogs would mistake these for mines. They would then be punished for that and start ignoring the real mines. The Germans remarked wryly, "The partisans have even recruited our dogs."
Besides the damage they inflicted on German troops and their morale, the partisans offered hope and example to those still in the midst of Nazi tyranny. Zoya Kosmodiemyanskaya, an 18-year-old member of the Moscow Komsomol, was caught setting fire to German stables in the village of Pestrehevo. Although tortured, she revealed nothing about her comrades to the German interrogators. As she was led to the gallows with a placard around her neck describing her crime, she turned to her German captors and proclaimed defiantly, "You can't hang all 190 million of us." The story of Zoya Kosmodiemyanskaya was circulated widely, and she became a national heroine. Zoya grew to be a symbol not only of partisan resistance, but the defiance of Russian womanhood in the face of the most terrible adversity. Ludmila Pavlichenko, a sniper who would eventually account for 300 German soldiers, was one of the first to challenge the prejudices of the Soviet military structure.
I joined the army when women were not yet accepted there. I had the option of becoming a nurse, but I refused, because I had learned to shoot before the war. Only after my insistent requests did my regimental sergeant major take me on as a sniper. I did not take up arms because I wanted to kill, but because I had seen ruined cities, villages razed to the ground, bereaved children, old folk, women and children murdered.
Sharing the responsibilities of the frontline soldier also meant sharing the risk of death and mutilation.
I was wounded in battle when the odds were heavily against us. Both legs and my hip bone were smashed, but I managed to crawl to the forest where I lay semi-conscious in the snow all night. When I was evacuated to Moscow, both my legs had to be amputated. As soon as I was discharged from hospital, I went back to my old factory. It wasn't all that easy to stand on a shift with my artificial limbs, but the thought that it was no easier where the fighting was kept me going. I was only 20 at the time, and my life was just beginning.
Like Katerina Yelena, a whole generation of young women lost their youth, and some, like the poet Yulia Derina, felt that they were in danger of losing their sexual identity as well.
Unharvested rye waves in masses. We also stride through it, the lasses, looking just like the lads. That is no hut that is blazing. That is my youth turned to ashes. Through the war go the lasses, looking just like the lads.
But while the distinctions between male and female soldiers might become blurred, according to Katerina Bosch-Cariona, the relationships between frontline nurses and their convalescent patients were as classical as ever.
What was a girl to say to a soldier who was going to battle tomorrow, whose chance of returning was so slim, and who on top of everything else was so attractive? See you after the war? At that time, death stood ready and waiting behind each and every one of us. Besides, life will go its own way even if there's a war on. Marriages were solemnized, abortions banned in the country in those days were permitted in field hospitals. Those who wished to have their babies were demobbed, provided with an allowance, and sent home. Many of us remained single all our lives. The happiness of front-line love was short-lived.
Away from the front line, a woman's life could be equally tough. In Leningrad, Leonid Panteley witnessed the tragic dilemma of a young mother.
There was a young woman with twins living with me in the same house. That first winter of the blockade, they were both dying. She too was not long for this world. She looked weak, lost and alone with her dependent ration card. One day she made a decision. I don't know what to call it, a crime or a feat of bravery. She realized she would not be able to save both her sons, so she stopped feeding one of them and he died. The second pulled through though. I saw him yesterday. A thin, pale and sad-looking boy, but he was alive.
The nightmare of raising children in a war of this magnitude sent the birth rate plummeting to the point where it became a grave concern of the authorities. There was also the obvious factor that men were away at the front for periods of over a year without returning on leave. Many of them were never to return at all. Dmitry Kedrin was riveted by the heartbreak which this caused.
What kind of ears were granted me, that deafened by thundering, clamorous strife, I can hear from the war's whole symphony only the crying of the soldier's wife?
Despite the suffering which the German invasion had brought about, the spring of 1943 seemed to infuse the consciousness of the Russian people with a new sense of optimism. The survival of Stalingrad and the ensuing counterattack had shown that not only could the German tide of victory be stemmed, it could be reversed. The people of the Soviet Union had taken everything that the Germans could throw at them, and the nation had held. By now, the majority of the population were willing cogs in a gigantic war machine. Civilians and soldiers alike seemed to grasp a new awareness of their role in the bitter conflict which raged all around them.
At the beginning of the war, there was still some complacency. Since we would win anyway, perhaps there was no need for a superhuman effort on our part. Perhaps things would work out without us. But the Germans poured on the lead without looking.
A bitter joke in circulation from Stalingrad told of a soldier going into battle carrying 150 cartridges. When he was carried to the field hospital, he had 151. He hadn't even had a chance to fire his gun. That was another extreme, contempt of death. This was written about and acclaimed as valor. But by mid-1942, there was too much of this contempt around, and yet the distance to victory was as great as ever. Sometimes the going gets so hard that death seems a welcome deliverance. Those are no empty words. Gradually, they stopped writing about this contempt of death. The mission of the soldier was not to die with dashing defiance, but to kill the enemy. The authorities continuously attempted to control the morale and attitudes of the frontline troops by the almost obsessional production of reading matter. Newspapers were printed on a portable plant which moved around with the troops. Each front, each army, and each division produced its own newspaper. The Ministry of Defense produced the Red Star paper, and the national newspapers were also distributed to the soldiers. By 1943, the conditions of the Russian troops at the front had improved tremendously. The spring lull meant that soldiers who had gone for months without washing could now visit the steam baths which had been erected behind the lines. The break in the fighting gave the field tailors' shops the chance to repair damaged uniforms, sped up the delivery of precious letters from home, and allowed the exhausted troops a much-needed period of rest and relaxation. While the conditions of the Russian soldiers continued to improve as the war wore on, the lot of their German counterparts began to deteriorate. In fact, by the spring of 1943, the German army in the east was almost on the point of collapse. In March, the Eastern Front, still extending from Finland in the north to the Black Sea in the south, was almost 500,000 men short of establishment. Divisional strength had been reduced from 9 to 6 battalions, while the casualty rate among experienced officers and NCOs had been particularly high. Equipment levels were low. For example, by February, only 500 German tanks remained serviceable, and most of these were still inferior to the Russian T-34s. The situation in the Panzer brigades became so desperate that Hitler was forced to recall General Heinz Guderian to active service. Guderian, one of the most able and audacious of the Panzer leaders, had been dismissed from his command in the winter of 1941, ironically for withdrawing forces without permission. He was now charged with responsibility for the future development of the armored troops along lines that will make the arm of the service into a decisive weapon for winning the war. Guderian was encouraged by the continued upswing in the production of the PZKW-6 Tiger tanks, 56 tons of well-armored mobile artillery, armed with a modification of the devastating 8.2 centimeter anti-aircraft gun. The Tiger boasted a top speed of 23 miles per hour on the road. Combined with the PZKW-5 Panther, the Tiger gave the Germans qualitative parity with the Russians for the first time since the beginning of the war. The Panther, weighing 45 tons, was lighter and more mobile than the Tiger, with a top speed of 34 miles per hour, while its 7.5 centimeter gun possessed considerable penetrative ability. Improved assault guns and tank destroyers were also appearing. Taking into account the upgunning of the Panzer Marks III and IV, the potential of German armor had never been greater. The problem for Guderian was to supply these weapons in such quantities that their possession by experienced crews would offset Soviet numerical superiority. Guderian's need for time to reorganize and re-equip the panzer divisions mirrored the requirements of the German army as a whole. The idea of any immediate victory in Russia was now simply the stuff of rhetoric. According to von Manstein, what did seem possible, given proper leadership on the German side, was that the Soviet Union could be worn down to such an extent that it would tire of its excessive sacrifices, 12 million killed or captured, and be ready to accept a stalemate. Given the inability of the German army to defend its complete front, such a draw could not be achieved by defensive tactics. The reverses to be imposed on the Red Army would have to be forced by a series of limited assaults. Von Manstein's counterattacks, which had prevented complete disaster during the previous winter, had impressed Hitler. He was invited to put forward a plan for the crucial summer campaign. Von Manstein presented Hitler with two offensive alternatives. The first was to prepare for a Soviet assault which would almost certainly be launched in the Ukraine and withdraw before it. Wheeling to the left, German forces would then mount a decisive attack on its exposed northern flank, encircling the leading spearhead of the Russian advance. The second alternative was to cut off the enormous Soviet salient which had emerged to the north of Kharkov and to the south of Orel, a bulge extending 70 miles westward from Kursk and measuring approximately 100 miles in width. Hitler chose the second alternative, despite the dilemma which it posed for the attacking forces. It was vital to attack before the Soviet generals got wind of the plan and could prepare defenses. It was also crucial to von Manstein that the offensive be launched before the Russians recovered from the losses incurred the previous winter. On the other hand, if the attack were to take place in mid-May, as von Manstein insisted, German manpower and equipment might not be sufficient to ensure victory. Guderian was against the operation from the start, arguing that the new Panther and Tiger tanks must be held back until they were available in sufficient quantities to ensure a decisive success. Hitler postponed the date of the attack until July, in the hope that by then the number of new tanks would tip the balance of firepower in Germany's favor. By now, Russian Air Force reconnaissance had improved to the point where Stalin's awareness of German dispositions was comprehensive and generally accurate. He had also managed to infiltrate German headquarters and was supplied with additional intelligence by his spy ring in Switzerland, code-named Lucy, which had many high-level contacts inside Germany. Stalin's knowledge of German preparations was so precise, he even knew the date chosen by Hitler for the launch of Operation Citadel against the Kursk salient. With every passing moment, the successful outcome of the Kursk offensive grew more necessary for Hitler. German morale, depleted by the failures at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, was now further undermined by defeat in West Africa. Hitler's inability to adequately supply Rommel with men and materials led to disaster at Medellin in March, and the eventual collapse of the Axis African forces in May. By June, southern Europe lay totally exposed to the threat of Allied attack. In Britain, the RAF and the American Air Force prepared to launch massive bombing raids against German industrial and civilian targets as a prelude to invasion from the West. Hitler not only needed a victory at Kursk, he needed victory on a scale which would allow him the breathing space to fend off the enemies which were beginning to close around him. Anything less would prove a catastrophe. Stalin, advised by Zhukov, prepared patiently and thoroughly for the German advance. The Soviet lines consisted of 6 belts of defenders composed of anti-tank posts, thick minefields, and 3,000 miles of trenches, supported by 3,000 tanks and 20,000 guns. For the first time, the Red Army would be prepared for a major German offensive. It was determined to make the most of its advantage. On July the 5th, 1943, as von Manstein and von Kluge approached the Kursk salient in a classic pincer movement involving 1 million men and 2,700 tanks, the death ride of the Panzers was about to commence.